Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. As you can see, I'm doing something brand new. This is the very first episode of Witch the Pot, based on an old Victorian phrase, bitch the pot, which literally meant pouring tea. It's where people started having social gatherings and they would call general chit-chat bitching. Obviously, we give it different connotations today, but it's where they would just have interesting conversations. So I decided that I would have Witch the Pot, where I talk to interesting magical people. And speaking of interesting magical people, we have here Arthur and a good friend of mine, Ben Stimpson. Hey Ben, how are you?
Hello, I'm good. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for joining me on this experimental endeavor.
I'm excited. I'm curious to see what's going to happen.
You never know with me, you know that. So let me introduce Ben very quickly for those of you that don't know. Shame on you for not knowing. How dare you? So Ben Stimpson, MBA. MBA, no, that is a completely different thing. You never know with me,
What is that?
including
Member of the Order of
reciting,
British Empire?
yeah, including reciting the alphabet. You'd think it would be so much easier. So Ben Stimpson, BAMBACP, is a therapist, author, folklorist, storyteller, and spiritual practitioner. Originally hailing from the United Kingdom, Ben grew up in Ontario, Canada. Ben has been involved in the magical community for over 20 years, with deeper involvement in a section of spiritual traditions, including Advaita, was it Advaita? Yes, Advaita Hinduism, Lucumí, espiritismo, Druidry, and British folk tradition. God, my dyslexia is so playing up with me today. How embarrassing. But I'm sure Ben will forgive me. So, Ben, we are here to talk about your book, Ancestral Whispers. Can you give us a flash of your book? And only your book.
That's the only thing I'm flashing today.
Yes. It's a gorgeous book. But first, let's get to know you a bit. So, as I've already mentioned, you're originally from the UK. You're from North Wales originally. But your dad actually is from about 20 minutes from me.
Literally 20 minutes away from you, near Swinton Cricket Grounds.
Yeah.
So it's like
so for anyone, anyone local, that's like Wigan area. So yeah, so you've got a bit of an interesting heritage, because you've got that part of you that is like some of the oldest bits of Britain. I always like the northwestern Wales because the borders fluctuated so much, because they were the longest holders of a Brittonic language. So a lot of culture there. You probably noticed that yourself, those little things. I know we've spoken before where you said some of the folklore that you know from up north, and you probably see the parallels with the Welsh folklore too.
It's interesting. We're currently working on my current project and really looking at how many of these cultures are on a continuum. And I know nowadays, especially in the West, we tend to want to think of these cultures as separate entities, unique, sovereign, all of that. But when you actually look at the lore that they're sharing, it's the same story shared all over the place, just landed in different ways. So it's kind of neat.
Yeah, it's beautifully put. It is. It is interesting. I really love how you find common truths in so many different places. I'm actually going to mention something about that from your book later, but for now, I want to know, how would you describe the path that you practice? We have so many diverse paths in our community, and you've got a lot of involvement with traditions, as I mentioned before, but how would you describe the meeting point for that on your personal path?
Oh, it's a good question. I'd say that I'm entering a portion of my life now where labels don't matter as much as they used to when I was younger. So, I practice relationship and relating to the landscape that I'm in, my ancestral spirits, the spirits that I work with. And the labels really are there to help other people kind of gauge where I am on that. So I practice spirit work. I say that I practice British folk tradition because I'm now a lot more inclusive of all of the traditions of that landscape and those cultures that I come from. I don't know if I call myself pagan anymore. I'm not sure. Like that's the community I'm strongly connected with. But I find that a lot of these traditions that I've been in, they've complemented each other and complemented parts of my life in a very strong way. A lot of it's been part of my healing journey that I talk about in the book. But really, it's about relationship. So it's me relating to people in my life, spirits in my life, the world around me, and finding my place in it. And I happen to do that through my spiritual practices, whether it be magic, whether it be kind of meditation pieces, whether it be spirit work and learning to communicate with spirits through ritual. That's kind of where I am. So that's kind of a flimsy, kind of all over the place answer, but I hope that answers the question.
Yeah, that was wonderfully put. I think the label thing is very difficult sometimes for people, because unless you're practicing something that is on the land that you're on and you're from that culture innately, it's very difficult to have labels, because it's finding your place. And you do touch on this in your book, where you've entered spaces, but you're very aware of where the boundary of respect and what's open to you and what isn't. And I thought that was a really great thing that you acknowledged, because some people just really bulldoze into traditions, and I think it's important to not put labels on. And like you said, you're finding your own path with your ancestors and your spirituality, and I think that was really greatly put, because it respects those cultures that you've had interaction with as well.
It's really integral to where I'm at, right? I think that labels can serve multiple different purposes. I think a lot of times, especially people coming into these traditions, the labels are more of a flag to other people to say, I belong, right? I don't have as much of a need to belong with a group nowadays, because I have I'm in a phase of my life where it's about me, right? It's about me and my relationships. And so my relationship to somebody who calls themselves, say, a Christian witch versus a pagan witch, or somebody who is, an Eastern meditation type, right? Those labels don't matter as much, because I often find there's more commonalities between all of those things, right? But labels are very important also when you're studying, when you're trying to learn about things, to kind of frame them and figure out kind of what are you focusing on, because it can just go, I mean, this, it can just become expansive very, very quickly, and you just go down rabbit holes. No wonder folkloric witches often turned into hares, right? So we could go into those rabbit holes.
I really like that. You have to put that in a book. You have to.
I will. I'm gonna record that later on and put it down.
Yeah, definitely. Speaking of labels, we share a label that is not one that many people share in our community, which is we're a therapist. So how does your therapy model, your understanding of the mind, influence or impact how you interpret spiritual things, or do you keep them quite separate?
I keep them separate, but they often interrelate, and I know you'll understand this. I'm pretty sure those other therapists who are listening will also understand this. There can often be in spirituality a psychologizing of spiritual experience, and part of my work has been to remove that psychologizing away to just experience, right? Because I think that label of seeing things as archetypes and as just kind of mental experiences, mental paradigms that you go through when you're engaging in ritual, has been quite damaging. It's removed the magic from things. But that being said, something I'm really, really curious about is the relationship then between kind of the way that the mind sees the world, the way that the mind formulates narrative. So a lot of my work is in transpersonal narrative systems, so family systems theory, and those contexts that we find ourselves in. And then how those create lenses, how we're then connecting with the world around us. So magic and magical ritual is very similar in many ways, similar mental state as play, whether it be like live action role play, whether it be playing video games, whether it be opening up a book and entering into a fictional world, right? Very similar relationships form between people and the figures that are encountered in those spaces. I feel like the psychologizing will come in and say, well, you know, spirits aren't real, it's all just in your mind. I think that it's a continuum. So for me, as in my therapy work, I tend to look a lot at narrative work. How are people telling themselves, how are people formulating stories in order to understand what they're encountering? And oftentimes myth and folklore are spaces that we enter into, right? In the same way that people would virtual spaces or you know, fictional spaces, whatever. So it's an interesting piece there, those relationships. And I feel like spiritual ritual, it's very interesting how people then relate to that. In my own spiritual work, then I tend to then separate those. It's all about relationship then for me, and it's about experience, and not trying then to kind of rationalize things, because psychologizing often comes with that rationalizing things, but that's only using one part of our minds. There's a huge subconscious that we often walk in the world. So they relate, they often don't relate. I tend to work a lot with people in the queer community, people in the alternative spiritual communities. And so then the questions I'm working with them in a therapy point of view would be, you know, when you're engaging in ritual, when you're part of this group, when you're engaging in magic, right? You know, how does that experience in your life, like any other type of experience, then impact how you're feeling, how you're, you know, how you're relating, like what's happening for you. And oftentimes spiritual experiences are awakening points for people. So I'm not here to say, well, you know, what's really happening for you is, you know, da da la la, right? What I'm interested in is, okay, you've gone through this intense ritual initiation experience. What's changed for you? How are you seeing the world now? How has that experience changed your relationship and how you walk in the world? And then that's the therapy aspect. You know, I hope that makes sense.
It makes total sense. Yeah.
And I knew it would to you.
Yeah, definitely. I think I'm sure it will to everyone watching as well. It is very interesting because I think, like you said, there's a lot of psychologizing magic and spirituality, and it has its place, like you said, like how just something changes, but making it wholly about the mind can sometimes be a little distracting, because then you start to filter experience to theory. And I think that we can't walk through life theorizing what we experience. It has to just be the raw encounter, and then what does that change within us? And
Totally.
it reminds me of the phrase, actually, when you was describing that, the first thing that magic changes is the self. You know, something changes in us when we work magic, and it doesn't mean that it halts there. It doesn't halt with us, but it definitely changes something. And
Yes.
that is important to
It's
acknowledge.
very
So thank you for that.
It's something that I feel really strongly about, because, and it's, again, I mean, I'm not the only one who's said this. Many people over the years have said the same thing. But I think that it ultimately comes down to that sense of control, right? Spirituality takes control away from us. And that's important for our growth, because we get caught in our ego, our negative ego, I should say. Ego in general is not a bad thing, but we get caught in that limited form of ego, where we then feel we can control and exert control over everything, things that we don't have control over. And part of that therapeutic process is coming to an acceptance of that piece. But I think that then that delegitimizes, and really people miss the point. I'll give an example. There's an influencer who, their opinion of folklore and their opinion of story and mythology is that it's just stories created by people. And therefore you can just create your own story and work with it as a spiritual framework, right? And I have a big problem with that, because that comes into that very old debate between what is created and what is natural, right? You know, like folklore develops and folk culture develops in a collective. Therefore, it's not controlled by one individual. Therefore, the collective, like consciousness, the collective identity, right, forms those stories based on the collective need, and people are framed by that, right? But if one person creates stories, it can become very dangerous, very narcissistic, very self-centered very, very quickly. And so in this way, I think it just misses the point. And so you then start to get into issues of people like AE co-etting, for example, become your own God. You just go down the rabbit hole of mental health stuff very, very quickly. And it goes into very, very dark and unhealthy places, right?
Yeah, sure. And I actually really liked what you said about the cultural myths and stories that are created by the people, they're not created by one person. And it reminds me of something I was saying. I was talking about deities with somebody once, as how on some levels they express the spirit of place. And I was saying like how in Britain we have no goddess of the volcano because we don't have volcanoes.
Yeah,
It's as simple as that. We don't need it because it's not part of our environment. So why would we placate a volcano that isn't there? And then it's like if you have like a landlocked area, they don't have a fishing god because there's nowhere for them to fish.
Yeah.
It's as simple as that. So we tap into something that's real, but we dress it up through our cultural understanding of how we interact with it. And like you say, that's not controlled by one person.
Yeah, exactly right. I mean, I think that there's a certain, not to backpedal, but like looking at like fake lore, for example. What often happens with fake lore when it's recognized on a social level as being needed, or that there's something in it that fills a niche within that's missing, is that oftentimes it will be assimilated. A very good example is Bethgelert in North Wales. So there's this cromlech in the middle of the mountains up in Snowdonia in Druidry there, just outside of Bethgelert, and it is like thousands of years old. But an innkeeper in the 1700s tried to drive up tourism by saying that this was the grave of the hound of one of the old princes of Wales, and the tragic story of how he killed this hound because he mistook it as killing his child, when really the hound was protecting the child from wolves and all of these things. And so it's the tragedy of Bethgelert. And of course, so many people came, because who doesn't love honoring a dog, right? How many statues of dogs are there everywhere that have turned golden because people touch them, right? And so there's a social niche there that's being filled, and suddenly the legend of Bethgelert is overlaid with that thing. Now, that being said, I know people who've gone to that place and they felt the presence of this dog that didn't exist in the first place, right? So it's interesting,
Yeah, it's like I can't remember exactly where it is. It's over here though, in the UK, this side of the pond, and there was the witch's grave, and everyone was talking about and trying, all the ghost hunters trying to contact this malevolent witch who'd been cursing the village. And it turned out it wasn't that old of a grave, and it was of a horse that was called Witch.
Yes.
And everyone was trying to contact this ancient witch, and it was like just some guy who'd buried his horse because it had died and it had been with him a very long time, and it was just a horse called Wage. And it's just about that they're all there like, oh, and she was blighting the crops and she was cursing the village, and it's like, it was a horse, calm down.
But with that, then it's an interesting thing, because that then gets into this idea of like, does a spirit start to form around that idea because enough people are believing in it, and at that point then does it take on its own thing, right? So it's does that horse spirit through an animistic sense become that witch because the community needs it to be, right? Or is there nothing there in the first place, right? It's interesting, right?
Well, it's how you touch on the family unit as an egregore, which I've said a lot, and I was like, yes, someone's actually seen this, because it's like everyone says like, well, when you form a group, an egregore forms, and it's like, well, what is a family unit? It is a group of people, and they're bonded by something. And so it's like you say, something could form if a need is there for it, because it starts to create something as a response.
Yeah, very much so. And I wish I could take credit for that idea, but that's been talked about through egregore work for a long time. But it is true. Like we look at family systems theory, right? Looking at it from a therapeutic lens. The culture of the family evolves in such a way that eventually everybody in that family unit is perpetuating that. and any threat to that family unit, suddenly the person is a black sheep, it's removed. It's as if the family culture is an egregore that is protecting itself, right? It's kind of a neat, it's very interesting. Yeah.
Well, we was talking about accents before, weren't we? Before we started recording, and
Yeah.
you actually mentioned how you noticed in a certain situation my Italian side came out more, and it's like you say, when you're in spaces with people, you naturally try and form those groups, and it's a very subconscious thing, but it exists.
Very much so. Well, it's that mirroring. It's a very common thing, and that goes back to our base psychology, right? And I think I was bullying you for your accent, not just talking about your accent. But we all do it. I notice it when I'm speaking to my Canadian friends versus my UK friends. I notice my Canadian accent will come out, and I hear it, and it's always weird. And I think a lot of people who have multiple accents going at the same time hear that, and it freaks them out, because then it's like, oh shit, I have an accent right now. It's weird.
Yeah, we've just had a BBC program called Domino Day release, and it was filmed in Manchester, although the travesty is only one person who, as far as I can tell so far from the cast, who was actually a sub-character, was actually from Manchester. Everybody else was everybody else was from London, putting on a Mancunian accent, even though they said they wanted this show to be representation. But I was really struck by a BBC, which is normally, I mean, anyone who has ties with the UK will know there is a description of certain accents being described as the BBC accent, meaning it would be what's acceptable on the BBC.
Yeah.
And it was so weird hearing a Mancunian or very northern accent on the BBC. It threw me, and I was like really like thinking it like, do I pronounce words like I do? That is how I would say that word. Or, oh, I wouldn't quite say it like that. And then there was one character, and I was going, they can't be from up north, surely, because of the pronunciation. But it's like you say, it's something that you don't think about until it's confronted. And then you think, wow, I have an accent. And I think that's the other side of social, if we want to use the occult term, a social egregore, because you're so immersed in it, you don't see it. You're part of it. It's like not seeing the woods for the trees. You're the tree, you don't notice the woods.
It's the thing. Yeah. No, it's true. And I mean, but at the same time, you can identify perfectly somebody from 5 miles down the road, right? When somebody's not from where you are. And it's interesting because that's kind of ties into folklore in many ways. Like folk culture and folklore is really the oral tradition. And when you start to look at the stories, and that sense of us versus them becomes very, very, very interesting, because you can see it when people know all us, and they know what us means versus them, which is usually the next town over, right? Or the next, region over, the next shire over, right? It's very interesting. And that idea of group, insiders and outsiders, it's just interesting. It really is just very interesting. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I was having a conversation very recently about words in place names in the Northwest that start WAL, which is a retraction of when in Anglo-Saxon period they would call people Welsh, because of course Welsh wasn't Wales, it wasn't the country, it was the non-Anglo-Saxon speaking people, because it was people who were still speaking Brittonic, and you get that in the Northwest too. And I find that interesting because we see like the Battle of the Red Dragon and the White Dragon, and we say like the White Dragon is the defeat of the English, but we have the Red Dragon here in the North too, because we see it as the spirit of the Red Rose that is Lancashire versus the White Rose, which is Yorkshire. So we see the English as being that side. Yeah, on a modern day map, I would be the English. But in the folklore, I would be part of the Welsh, because Cornwall was part of the Welsh. And then you see like the Arthurian mythology, and people will say it's Welsh mythology. But then you see it in Cornwall, because it's the birthplace of King Arthur. You have places throughout Wales, and then you have it up into the north, where your dad's from. Yeah, where your dad's from is where roughly they think from the oldest source material would be where they would describe when they're talking about places like Camelot, it would be round that general region, and yet people will say, oh, it's a Welsh myth, and they will put it on that modern border, as opposed to Welsh not being a country but being a language and a culture and a mythology. And yeah, it's very interesting, because you know that, like you said, you know where you're in something and someone's different to you. And so when I see the Welsh myths, I know those myths are here too. I know they're down there, but somebody else who doesn't know that will, they will put a different barrier on where those people are. Yeah, sure.
Exactly. Yeah. And this is, I mean, to tie in the ancestral stuff there, this is where in the diaspora, a lot of people find or have issues, because that nuanced understanding doesn't exist over here in North America or in Australia or outside of the UK, right? Well, even in the UK, that nuanced understanding doesn't.
Yeah.
But it's very interesting how then people identify themselves based on their ancestral heritages. You know, people say, well, I'm proud Scots heritage. Okay, where did your family come from? Oh, you know, just down in like, you know, like Berwick area. Oh, I see. Okay, so you're English then? No, Scottish, because, well, you know, like that whole region was in flux. That whole region is all over the place, right? So it's interesting how even that come back to labels, right? Labels are more of a signal to other people than they are necessarily to reality. And there's, you know, often a signal to ourselves. We want to belong, so we say, I'm a Scots-Irish person, or I'm a Welsh person, or I'm a, when the history is so much more complex. I mean, in the north, it's a very good example of the place names, right? You know, when you look at a lot of places in Cumbria, right? A lot of those, like that whole region was Brittonic at one point. Even Cumbria, right, is cognate with Cymru, which is the Welsh word for Wales, right? That whole region was a Welsh kingdom, the kingdom of Strathclyde. That whole region in Wales is called Hen Ogledd, right, the Old North. And when you look at like archaeology and even DNA, the vast majority of English people, except for those really in the far south, have continual Brittonic relationship and DNA. So it's just that they were just like, they weren't driven out. The Britons weren't driven out of those areas. They just were kind of subsumed, and then they assimilated and became English, right? It's yeah, it's very fascinating. But it tells all ancestry, and this is what I found when I was writing my book. How people identify their ancestry says a lot more about themselves than it does necessarily about their ancestry.
Yeah, 100%. Which
Yeah.
segues me beautifully to my next question, because when I was saying about the social egregore and where different people will put those borders, you have a wonderful line in your book where you mention about not thinking about yourself being British until you was in Canada, and it was the thing that made you different to the other people around you, really. Particularly at school, it was the thing you describe it as, you was othered as British, where of course in Britain that wouldn't have been a thing because everyone was British. So how did you find connecting with your home roots, because you do describe the UK as home in your book? How did you reconcile connecting with home ancestry on a foreign soil?
This is the thing that I think I'm going to struggle when I finally come back later in the year, because, you know, like my younger brother, he was 6 when he came over. He doesn't remember back home, so Canada is home to him, right? But I was old enough I could remember, and because of the abuse that I had perpetuated against me, bullying and all of that, I never really connected with Canada as home. It never felt like home. I've certainly felt a little bit like it's home now, but I've always been more directed over there. And so in many ways, the way that I connected with back home was through story, right? British television. You know, I grew up on all the same comedy shows that we love, right? You know, listening to radio, BBC Radio, all of these things, right? Going into the folklore. Folklore really was a huge part of that for me. And so my concept, until I finally came back and worked in the UK for 6 months about 10 years ago, a lot of that was how I thought it was and how I, you know, how my vision of it, right? So the connecting with that was through, I don't even know how to say it really. It's more of a fantasy version. And then I picked up on the fact that, okay, well, this isn't the reality of it. When I went back in 2010, I actually worked for 6 months over there, and that was an eye opener for me because I was a lot more immature back then. I was practicing pagan, but my paganism was very like 101 paganism, right? This, that, and all the other. And so many of the places I was visiting with this group I was working with, I'd never been before. So it was weird for me because I was in England, right? Home, but I'd never been to any of these places before. So, and of course the accent down south was all like southern accent, like, "Oi, Tracy," and all that, right? So I didn't even sound like I was from there. People would ask me, "Oh, so," because my Canadian accent, they could only hear my Canadian accent. "Oh, so where are you from in Canada?" "Well, I'm actually from over here," but it's weird. So I connected through story, and then when I clued into that, it was this, okay, I need to actually sit down and really think about, okay, well, what is this sense of home for me? And I around that time, I also had a good friend who actually was from the Wirral, so quite close to where we're from too. But he came over around the same age as me, and he just didn't. He saw it just as a place he was born. Canada was home for him. So I had some really deep, good conversations with people who I could appreciate where I was coming from, and I think I worked a lot of it out for me. And so then it was, okay, I figured out that it's not necessarily landscape, it's the cultural piece. And so really what makes me British versus Canadian. And I'm now, as I'm preparing to move, I'm noticing how Canadian I am, you know. It's weird. It's a very strange thing. So it's convoluted. I hope that answers the question. I feel like I may have gone all over the place with that.
No, you answered it perfectly. It's interesting because for me, my practice is tied literally to the land that I was born on and I still live on. So it's very worlds apart for me. So it was an interesting thing for me to ask, at least for my interest, because I have no lived experience of trying to connect with something somewhere else. And you're right, I think it is through the stories, through the culture, that you would keep that tie strong, and that's so important. Yeah, it really
If I
is.
can add to that, that's
Yeah, sure.
like people ask me, so why was folklore so important to you? And it's literally because, and where is it here? I have to grab it because it was such an important book for me, wherever it is. I don't even know where it is here now. Oh, come on. Oh, here we go. Okay. So I actually originally started to explore Wicca because in the 10th grade over here, we did this really cool exercise of creating a family coat of arms. And at that point in my life, I had no idea about my family because my parents don't really share anything, right? And it was one of those things where it was, it was so out of the way. So like my family were like, oh yeah, we're in Canada now. We're not going to talk about UK, right? My grandparents were over there, all of those. So I had no stories about the UK other than the few television shows. And at that point in my life, I didn't even know myself. The self-awareness was not. So I started to become really interested in the fairies and the folklore and things like that. And then I discovered the Myths of Avalon. And I was like, oh, this is so cool. A goddess religion in King Arthur's Camelot, all of this. This is really cool. So I started heavily going into Wicca and things like that. And I added a pentagram to this coat of arms. And then I got myself this book. And it is absolutely still one of my absolute favorite books. It's Spirits, Fairies, and Leprechauns, and an encyclopedia. And it's by a woman who I believe she worked with the University of Kent down in Canterbury. And it was just like literally just an encyclopedia of it was like Catherine Briggs's stuff, right? It was just fairy stories from the UK. And it was just so enchanting and wonderful and beautiful. And it was like, oh, I remember some of these from when I was a kid, right? And so that was my way into the spirituality. And that's why spirituality is so tied in with the UK. But it was one of those things where it was like, it saved me because I didn't have anything else. And this was pre-internet too. Like we got the internet in like 2001, right? So, and even then it was like maybe half an hour of it on, you know, as weird as it sounds to the younger people listening to this, there was a time where the majority of the time we didn't want, you know, spend on the internet. So I found myself through that. But I think now as a more mature individual, um, it's that understanding of place then, because in all that time, I never really appreciated relationship with place. And now over here, like my parents just moved from where I effectively grew up, small tiny town that I grew up in. They left there 2 years ago, but we'd been there for 25 years. I got this sense every time I drive through that place, oh, it's you again. There's no sense of belonging to that place, right?
Mm.
And I realized all these years, I never invested in developing a grounded sense of place in this landscape because I didn't want to be here, right?
Mm.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's so interesting that you know, I guess you sort of, I'm trying to think of the right way to put it. I guess with you saying that you saw UK as home, you remembered it as home. So I think there was obviously that element of you that was very adamant, even from that young age, that you wasn't going to set your roots down there because you already knew where you needed to be, and you've carried on pursuing that. And I think that was very admirable to, you know, you moved when you was 8, I believe it was, yes, 8 years old, to make that decision then and still be following through with that. You are moving back to the UK this year. It shows that determination and that commitment to your own self-identity, which is so important. And sometimes people would buckle under that. So I think that's a testament to you as an individual, that you knew who you were and you was going to do everything that you needed to do to keep that connection alive. And I think that's really wonderful.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. It's one of those weird things, like I always feel awkward even talking about it because, you know, a lot of people over here in North America who've never lived over there, and their relationship to it is through that kind of cultural hand-me-down of, you know, we came over here 200 years ago from the homeland, or they only think of it as the, you know, the landscape of castles and the landscape of King Arthur, the landscape of, you know, fairies and whatnot, right? Trying to explain that just deep connection to not only just a landscape, and this is where the ancestral work in, the landscape that all of my ancestors are buried in, right? But also that place of I'm part of that landscape too. I'm part of that story, and that spiritual pull. Like I don't know how to explain it to people without sounding like a crazy person. But I feel like my future is in that landscape. That there's something I need to do over there. That there's some little niche that I can fit into, right? And so like it's just the way has been opening up before me, right? Things have been closing down over here. Like my car, I know I talked to you about my car dying. and somebody made a good point. It's like all these things that are ending for you, it's almost like it's just one last thing that you have to deal with before you go. It's like, okay, go, okay, go. No, your car's dead. You don't have to worry about that now. Okay, go. No, your line of credit's paid off. Okay, go. You know, so.
Yeah.
But we'll see when I get over there and I can't find a flat and all of that. We'll see what happens.
Yeah, I think that's great. You made a really wonderful point. It reminded me of a witch. I won't name her. She's no longer alive. I want to respect her family because I don't have permission to mention her name, which was quite well known in the UK. And when you said, "Oh, it's romance says is like the land of like castles and fairies," and I remember someone was talking to her about Stonehenge for the summer solstice, and they was talking about going down to see, oh, she said about seeing the sunrise, and there was like automatically, so you're going to Stonehenge, and she said, well, why would I go to Stonehenge to see the sunrise? And they went, well, it's this place that you go. And she said the best line ever, and it's always stuck with me, and she said, the sun that rises at Stonehenge is the same one that rises over the local tip. I don't have to travel to see the sunrise. Right. And I just thought that was perfect because it's true. You know, we romanticize the land sometimes, and it's important to remember that when it's somewhere that you live or somewhere that you have connections to, it's just home. You don't segregate these places as things that you go to. I was talking to somebody else not that long ago about Stonehenge, and they said, I went and it wasn't very impressive. And then they said, and then some of the locals said, well, you need to come to Avebury, go to Avebury Circle. And they went, it's like literally just down the road. And it was so powerful. And they asked me my opinion of why that was. And I said, because, and I shouldn't have probably said this online because everyone will start going to Avebury. Please don't go crashing Avebury. But the thing was, I said, it's because it still works. People still go there. They're still doing rituals. It's switched on. No one's been doing anything at Stonehenge. We don't even know why it was built. We have guesstimation, but we're not working on that site. So it's dormant. It's flat. It's a tourist spot, quite frankly. And everyone goes and says, "Oh, I saw Stonehenge." I've never been, because I know that to a point, there's no point in pilgrimaging there because it's as switched off as the post office. You know, I may as well just stand in line at the post office. It's short.
It's true, right? It's true. Like one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had was when I was working over there. There was a day trip to Canterbury, and we went to Canterbury Cathedral. Now I know that is a tourist trap. I know that, but when I was walking up those steps, that over the past 1,000 years, people have been walking up, kneeling up, right? And it's a lived experience. You feel the smoothness of that stone and know that people still do that. Like there were still pilgrims going and doing that in that space. That is that part of that living continuum of culture that I think is the draw. And I think that people who have not grown up with that can be very shocking. So we have to learn to love a place as it is instead of what we want it to be, I was talking to who was I talking to last night? I was talking to a big group of spiritual people, and they were talking about, like, the question was, cultural appropriation, which I know we've done to death. We're going to talk about it again, but it's one of those things where it's like when you haven't grown up in a place, you don't appreciate, or you may not appreciate the reality of that thing. And so then what the cultural appropriation piece is coming in with the fantasy and overlaying that, right? So it's, going to Wales, going to Scotland and wearing a kilt and being like, I'm part of Clan McGregor or clan whatever it is, right? And people are like, oh, cool, yeah. Wait, you mean that's not as important? What? It's new, like the nuanced lived culture is the important bit. And I think that for me is where I find myself constantly in between, because although I am Canadian in mentality for many things, I never really felt comfortable in this culture. I feel very comfortable in that culture over there because it's a lived experience for me. But it's weird because I've been away from it for so long. So there's going to be an adjustment period, So.
Yeah, that was actually going to be my next question. See, everything's just flowing so beautifully. I was wondering how you suspect, because like you said, you have spent time here, you've worked here, but I wonder how you anticipate or maybe suspect that, if at all, that your practice, your ancestral practice will shift, actually practicing it here versus in Canada. Do you anticipate any kind of difference or anything that might change because of the land that you're on when you're venerating your ancestors or engaging with your practice?
Absolutely. So, the type of style of my practice is very heavily influenced by Lucumí, and Lucumí is a mobile tradition, right? So Lucumí is it developed in such a way that it was away from the homeland of West Africa, right? So it became a family lived tradition that was usually in the household. And so then all, like, the house itself is the spiritual landscape that you exist and work within, right? So a lot of my my ancestral practice is around, like, having a space for my ancestors in my space, so that they're there, always present and accountable for, right? As weird as that is to sound, that the difference between that then practicing that way and being in the UK is, at least for my biological ancestors, I'll actually be able to go to the places that they lived, right? We have all of the records. Like I know where my great-grandfather's cottages down in Beer in Devon, right? I know where my grandparents' ashes have been strewn, and it's actually quite close to where you are up in Warrington, right? So it's one of those things where I know I can actually go to those spaces and go to, you know, my parents' old pub and all of these things to have access to those spaces again. I don't know if it will necessarily change the relationship, because I already have that relationship with them. You know, a lot of my spirit work is direct communication with these individuals, right? I think what will change is, because the majority of my core family will remain here in Canada, I'll suddenly be again outside. You know, I don't really have strong relationships with my external family over there. That was one of the downsides of moving, you know, 7 hours air travel away. And I don't know if I'll necessarily have a relationship with him, you know. But I think what will also change is that I'll actually have space to actually go to the places of my affinity ancestors, the other types of ancestors that I work with. So like landscape ancestor is really important for me. The land as an ancestor, right? I was born over there. Part of my body is made up of molecules that came from over there, right? And so, you know, I have a really strong emotional connection to that landscape. So being in that landscape all the time. But that being said, that will also change, because it'll be a lived landscape for me, right? It'll be like, you know, I'm not going to be, you know, tiptoeing around being like, I'm on a sacred landscape. You know, I'll still be like, you know, having a pee if I need to on the side of the road if I'm out in the middle of nowhere. You know, one of those things. So, yeah, I hope that answers the question.
It does, yeah, it really does. It's interesting when you do move back, because obviously, for anybody who doesn't know, we are friends. We talk privately all the time. I'd be interested when you've been here like a month or two, just revisiting that question with you. I will do, just because I am intrigued if anything surprises you. I don't want to put anything in your head, but I've known someone from America whose heritage was here and they were only visiting, but they had like a particular experience, and I'm just wondering if you would have something similar, because they're very similar truths. But like I said, I'm not going to put it in your head to start with. I'm just curious. Is it a one-off event? Is it something that everybody experiences? Because like I said, it's not an experience I have or can have unless I moved away and then moved back. So, yeah. I mean,
I am prepared for something. Like I'm prepared for, I mean, because the last time I was back was 2010, so like what, 14 years ago, right? And I was a very different person. I have been helping myself prepare myself by trying to build a network of people over there, heavily investing in creating relationships, like with you, like with, you know, some of the other boys around the area. It's one of those things that's really important, and even through that, I'm noticing again how sometimes in some ways I'm very different. I'm very direct, like North Americans are, which is going to become a problem when I'm over there, because British people pussyfoot around like you wouldn't believe. You know? You know, as a Northerner, I know you're direct, but how direct?
Very. You'd be surprised.
Well, I've always loved that joke about Northerners, and it's said by a Southerner. It's a very old joke, but it's people from Yorkshire and Lancashire are just like the Scots, except not as friendly. And it's like, okay. You know, but that's the thing. But that's the thing. That's the connection between culture and landscape, right? Harsher cultures tend to become like they live in harsher environments, right? You know,
it's true. It's one of those up north. You will, if you ever use public transport, whoever you sit next to, you'll finish that conversation on the bus like you've known them for decades, and then you will never see that person ever again. You'll get their life story, but yeah, it's a very strange landscape. But like you said, though, it's part of culture. It's automatic. It's how the group works. But I think you'll fit in quite well. Like you said, there's things that I said that that remind you of your dad. So I think that will flag up with you, and you'll find that familiarity there.
Yeah.
So
I
that'll
hope so.
definitely
I mean,
help.
that's the thing. I also realize how much I think like people from over there, you know, and that's always been a thing. And that's like, I think that I had a friend who moved to Wales about 2 years ago from over here, and she was shocked because of the whole Prince Andrew thing. So when Prince Andrew the musical came out, she was shocked as to why would you make a musical about this horrendous, horrific thing? And I had to pull her aside and say to her, because it's the way that British people do this. They're uncomfortable with this topic, and they're trying to make, like, they're really trying to destroy him. So what's the best way to do that? To make him a comic book character, right? Bring him down, make him a laughing stock, and then he's not serious anymore, right? And she was like, oh.
Yeah, it's part of royalty anyway, though, isn't it? Though you always had the bard who brings the satire that takes down the aristocracy. It's always part of the fool's job. You step out of line and you become ridiculed by everybody. You go from being a noble to being the laughing stock of everybody that you're supposedly above.
Better, yeah.
And you become the person who's in the gutter, and
Totally.
we're a self-deprecating culture anyway. We laugh at ourselves all the time, but yeah, it is a culture thing. I think it's like the Punch and Judy things too. People never understand Punch and Judy. They're like, a guy hits his wife with a club, then she takes a club and hits him with it, then he has a fight with an alligator, and then the police officer comes and arrests him, and it's like, what's going on? And it's just something that's there, but it makes sense to
it
us.
makes sense in that cultural context. Exactly.
In a cultural context,
North Americans, where individualism is such a big thing, it's like the thought of being made an individual laughing stock by the rest of society is horrifying, right? You know, so even the humor I get too, right? Like, you know, I try. I said, this is a horrible joke, but I said this joke to a friend over here, and they didn't find it funny. But I know a lot of people over there would. It's the joke, you get the it's different variations, but it's, you know, 3 guys, they marry 3 women, one's from Greece, one's from Italy, and one's from the north of England. And there's another variation where it's like, she's from Scotland, she's from Ireland, she's from Wales, right? And it's the first guy says, oh yeah, my wife from Greece, she's great, she cleans, she cooks everything, she's amazing, and does everything I need her to do. Okay. The guy from Italy, yeah, my Italian wife does everything, like she cooks, she cleans, she does everything. So the guy who marries the northern girl says, okay, I'm gonna put my foot down and do this. So he goes home and he says, this is what I want you to see done, and this is what you're going to do, and that's great. First day, he sees nothing. Second day, nothing. Third day, the swelling is starting to go down, and he can almost see a little bit out there. Now, we're not making fun of domestic violence there, right? But in a Western, you know, individualistic North American context, that's horrific. Like, how bad is that? So I notice then in those ways how perverse my British sense of comedy is.
Well, it's actually interesting that I mentioned the Punch and Judy, because the Punch and Judy came over from Italy through the church, and the people don't get it because they're like, oh, this guy's battering his wife, and then she said battering the crap out of him, and then an alligator beats him, and then a cop comes and beats him up. But the whole idea is that they were called morality plays. The idea is you don't beat your wife.
Yeah, exactly.
And you know, although it's done in a humorous way, because what's a crocodile going to break into your house and start beating you with a club for, and then steal some sausages, you know, from the butcher? It's humorous, but the idea is, what is acceptable behavior? It's morality, but it's presented in a fun way because it's normally put on as children's entertainment. But people find that so bizarre. But it's like, if you actually really scrape under the surface, what is the teaching? The teaching is you don't participate in domestic abuse or domestic violence, which everyone would agree with.
Oh, totally.
Teaching it in a fun way, and everyone's like, what is this horrific thing?
Yeah.
And yeah, I think it's the way that we address things in different cultures is
Totally.
Quite
It's one of the, it's an
strange.
example like we were talking about with the subconscious piece, right? You know, there's so much cultural pieces in the subconscious that makes sense just because we're not, you know, directly looking at them. You know, we just subconsciously understand what the meaning of the deeper perspective of that is. And but then when you put light on it and see it from a different contextual lens, then it's like, oh, like what is this? As you know, so but that's a whole other conversation we could have.
It is. So I also wanted to ask you, so we've talked about how you described your path, but one thing that I mean, correct me if I'm wrong, we were saying before, you're like the most interviewed person at the moment
Hardly. Matt Oren
at
maybe, but not
Llewellyn.
me.
Possibly, yes. You're very close. But so you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but the one thing I never noticed anybody ever ask anybody in an interview, and I always think it's such an interesting thing to ask, is we've discussed how you got to where you are on your path and the influences that are there, but what keeps you on it? What stops you from wandering off onto something else? Why is this there for you?
I think because I finally stumbled onto something that I can fully express myself through. Right. I look at the group of people that I've surrounded myself with. They're all witches, all pagans, all like charmers. They're all involved in magic somehow. They're all queer, or most of them are, right? They're all of a similar age, like we're all in our 30s, like late 20s, early 40s, right? We all kind of have very similar humor. We all are interested in the same thing. So I feel like I've finally landed in a group of people that are like me. And when I actually get to chat to a lot of them through my own podcast, right, we've gone through very similar experiences, right? We all experienced spiritual experiences when we were younger. You know, we may have, you know, had hag attacks. We may have experienced, you know, connection with the fairies or had ghosts, or, you know, many of us have mediumship skills, right? We all maybe are on the spectrum to some degree, right? We all have gone through shit. And so for me, it's a way of expressing all of those things and also finding purpose in life. And I think that's where I've really come down to. That's why I think my therapy professional side and my spiritual side really come together, is that sense of purpose, and through that a sense of hope. You know, because I spent a lot of years where I was hopeless, right? Not to go too deep there, but I was very hopeless for a long time. And so the past 5-6 years, I have done more things that I've wanted to do in my life than the previous 20, where I was being told what to do, right? You know, if I had listened to, if I was the person I am now back when I was 19, I would not have done social work training. I would have gone in and done medieval studies like I had wanted to do, right? The past 2 years of finishing my degree by going and studying medieval studies, classical studies, religious studies, all of these beautiful things that I love, right, have been just amazing. You know, I can walk in and a lot of the professors are, you know, people like me, very similar ages too. Like one of my professors was literally the same age as me, and I'm like, you know, so that keeps me on my path. That keeps me on my path. My path is allowing me to explore and go deeper into that. And I mean, maybe in 10 years' time, I might be a born-again evangelical Christian. I don't think I will be, but you never know, right? But that's that's a wonderful piece, right? Of the exploration of self and the exploration of will, and then how I relate, because I feel like I relate so healthily now to the world around me and who I am, and the people in my life, that that I cringe at some of my younger versions, right? When I was a teenager, people say, I can't believe you're 38 years old. You look so young. And I'm like, yeah, because when I was a teenager, I was an angry, bitter little old man, you know? You know?
I appreciate that answer, and I appreciate the level of your honesty too. So thank you for that. So before we go talking more about your book in a bit more depth, I'm going to take a bit of a sip of a drink too. And I did mention that I was going to do this with you, which is I want all the people that I interview to answer some quick fire questions, which need no context given. I'm just interested in it. So if it's an either or, then it's just which one, and that's it. No explanation needed.
Okay, no explanation.
And then after that, I'm going to ask you very quickly favorites of things, and again, it's just first thought reaction.
Okay.
Right. So these are the either ors. So we've got text or talk.
Talk.
Tea or coffee.
Tea.
Invisibility or mind reading.
Invisibility.
Buffy or Charmed.
Buffy.
And McDonald's or KFC.
Oh, McDonald's all the time. KFC shit.
And then favorites. Favorite season.
Autumn.
Favorite color.
Purple.
Favorite song.
Ooh, Baba Ye 2 by Christopher Tin.
Favorite book.
Damn. Changing Planes by Ursula K. Le Guin.
And favorite film.
Oh, Shirley Valentine. Have you seen that?
Thank you. I haven't seen it. I will do though. And that concludes our quick fire round. Thank you for that. It was. I actually like those kinds of questions because I think they can create subtle insights without really needing to justify them.
Yeah.
And it gives us a bit more about them, which is always a great thing. Anyone who doesn't know you needs to follow you, which of course I will get to all that at the end. So quick questions about the book. So we've actually touched on some of these questions. So I'm going to see which ones we haven't touched on, because some of them they flowed in. Show us again without your hand on the cover. We need to see what it looks like. Perfect. Thank you. Because of the cover, this actually leads me into my first question. So at the very beginning of the book, well, I say at the very beginning, you have an introduction, and then you go straight into an exercise, which involves a very particular kind of tree. And I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about why you chose that exercise and why you decided to put it so early in the book.
It's about story. So this is very, very intentional on my part. If you give somebody a story or a very vivid symbol, then it can be a drawing off point. It can be a jumping off point for them. So the exercise, and it's available on the Llewellyn website, people can go and read it if they want to, is approaching the tree of life and death. And in the tree, which we often, we visualize genealogical trees as trees, right? So it's a tree, but all of the fruit are skulls. And I thought that was such a vivid image. I really loved it, and it came to me in a dream, so it came from somewhere. But it's that idea of going to the tree of life, but also seeing the death, like all the dead relatives in there too, and understanding that we too will be a fruit that will eventually turn into a skull and join that, right? So it was a way of grounding people into that process, because I don't give anybody anything else after that. It's all just questions. It's all just information that to frame people thinking about that experience. So, but that's a space at least that they can go to if they don't have anything.
Yeah, it was a beautifully written piece. It really was, and I felt like it needed to be acknowledged, particularly because it's part of the illustration of the cover, isn't it? It's
it is. Yes, it is. Yes, it is.
And I thought it was great that. Go on, you carry on.
No, go on.
I was just going to say, and I felt that it was great, the position that you put it in the book. It was so well. You didn't even necessarily, we don't even go into chapter 1. It's right there. And it's something that, like you said, it's a jumping off point for everything else that follows after. It was so well positioned. But I wanted, of course, not my interpretation of why it was there, but I wanted it from the author themselves.
Of course.
So the natural question is, why venerate ancestors? For you, what's your answer for that?
Well, it's foundational. So in the same way that exercise, that image is foundational to the rest of the book, for me, ancestor work is foundational. And in truth, I would say since I really heavily started working with my ancestors. Like, they've always been around, right? I've always been curious. Even when I was a teenager, I wanted to learn more about my ancestors because I vaguely remember my grandparents, and like images here and there. And then spent, like, my other side, my mum's side, I have a lot of good memories with them. But they are over there. I didn't even get a chance to go to their funerals because most of them died before we came over, but I was too young. And then when we were over here, the remaining, I just didn't. So ancestors have always been there. The story in the family has always been there. When I actually started sitting down and working with the ancestors, it was actually part of my psychotherapy degree as well. So we did something called a genogram, which is looking at family systems and looking at how those patterns came down the family. And so I was involved with Lucumí, where ancestor work is foundational as an entry point, right? And I'm not initiated into Lucumí, I'm not a priest, but anybody who comes to that tradition, ancestor work is foundational. That's the ground that we walk upon, right? And I was also doing this psychotherapy work where I was looking at family story and how the stuff I had to deal with in my family came back from maybe 5 or 6 generations back. The spooky coincidences and communicating with some of these, the spooky coincidences being that on both my mum's side and my dad's side, 7 generations back, both of their paternal grandparents were in the workhouse. Right? Both of those individuals came down and perpetuated a family story of being self-made tradespeople, work for yourself because don't work for anybody else. A very northern, very, very northern story, right? So then when I started to listen to the stories about these people from my mum, right, in like Lincoln, one of my great grandfathers had a very, very famous shoe shop. He was a cobbler in Lincoln in 1890. And my grandfather remembers going to that shoe shop when he was young. All these things, like suddenly I was communicating with these individuals, and then I could see, oh, I see where that comes from in me. I see where that drive to succeed comes from in me. But I also realized where all those negative things. So that's both of those pieces were in tandem. And I think that having just the one or the other wouldn't have worked so well. So that's where the psychotherapy and the other therapy piece and the spiritual piece came from. So then when I got a chance to actually sit down and have dumb supper, a friend facilitated dumb supper, and my grandfather came and sat down in the chair. And I asked him, why did you treat my dad so roughly all his life? And he said, you have to understand, if I knew then what I know now, I wouldn't have treated him like that. And then I got the validation of how proud they are of me. And that was huge because I don't hear that a lot from my parents because of their own struggles, So that was huge. That was really huge. And so the veneration practice naturally came out of that. And then I started to look at other beings in my life, other things in my life, and that veneration. I think in the West, we're very, we have biases against these things because of the wordage, right? But if you look around the world, people don't have qualms worshiping their ancestors because they don't have the cultural hang-up that's given to us through Christianity of only God can be worshipped, right? So we use the language of veneration. Well, I worship my ancestors. It just doesn't mean that I worship them in the same way that you're thinking that word means, right?
I do. That's a really great point about it being foundational because, as well, like you say, it's part of your stories. It's the things that come down. It's the impact that it has on you. I have very strong feelings about ancestor work, and I think after reading your book, we are very aligned on a lot of that thinking because, like you say, it is so foundational because it's ultimately who we are. We come from these people. Without them, we wouldn't exist.
Very much so. Well, and if I can jump in, when you're engaging in any cultural tradition, right? And I'll drawing from what you said in when I interviewed you, when you're working with mediumship skills or when you're working with charms that have been handed down to you from your grandparents and so on, from that cultural line, you're doing something that they did. So they have a hand in that because they handed it to you, right? So acknowledging that presence and acknowledging their role in that and your role in that linked chain, that's veneration, right?
Absolutely. Yeah. And speaking of things passed down, leads me. See, everything is going so smoothly. I knew you would be the best first person for launching this.
Love it.
Because
I'm honoured that I'm your first. I'm really honoured that I popped that cherry. So thank you.
We mentioned, or you mentioned, I mentioned it to you before though, and I know that you got something ready to show us with that, is objects as ancestors. As things age, they have that power, and in many cultures they can become honoured, and when they're no longer needed, there's certain processes they need to go through. So can you tell us a bit about the object that you brought?
Yeah, for sure. So when I delved into my ancestry and I actually saw where they all came from, this is where I feel like the whole of the UK, the whole of Britain and Ireland, of course Ireland isn't part of the UK, I have to be very careful with that, but all of those islands are home to me because my ancestors in the past 4 generations came from all of those places. So I have literally ancestry, like my great grandmother was half Irish, my other side Welsh, my other side Scottish, my other side from Devon, my other side from the north, and my Stimpson side comes from Norfolk and Essex originally, about 178 years ago. So all of these pieces, they all managed to come into Manchester and meet and have babies, right? It's funny, isn't it? So I was looking at my dad's paternal side, who come from Devon, and we actually have one of their canes. So this is my great grandfather's cane. And somewhere I think I actually have a photo of him holding this back from like 1909 or something like that. But it's amazing. And that physicality, we were talking about story and that foundational piece. Physicality can be very, very foundational. When you touch something that somebody else held, right, that you knew belonged to your great grandmother or your grandmother, whoever, right? And you're like, wow, you get a better sense of them through that because you're literally holding something that was also in their health. You're feeling the sensation. This is why oftentimes cultural traditions, why I love Dawn's podcast so much, is about food. When you're tasting something that you know your great grandmother, your great grandfather, whatever made, and also tasted, for that split second, you are connected with that person in a way that you wouldn't be able to just by listening to it, right?
Yeah, that's very, very true. I've got some books
Yeah,
behind me that were either belonged to family or they were gifted to me by family. So even if the books I don't need anymore, I would never part with them. And then somewhere, even though we've not been Christian for a very long time in my family, actually, we have, it's actually quite damaged now because it's age. I would love to get it restored, but I'm also bothered about what would have to be ripped off it to restore it. But we have an old family Bible, and what I love about it is it's got the name of the guy who first bought it and the year that he bought it in, and that's just handwritten in the front. And I can't remember the exact year, which is so annoying. I'm going to get back to you on that though. The cover is actually so fragile, that's why I can't remember it, because it's come away from the spine now, and I'm so bothered about touching it that every time I touch it, another bit snaps off, and it's it's so. But yet the rest of the Bible is so beautifully intact, and every book has an illustration, and all the colours are so immaculate and preserved. And then between the Old and the New Testament, births, marriages, and death pages, and you've got you can see when we stopped being Christian because we stopped adding names in the thing. There's a cut off of marriages because no one was going to church, and then the deaths cut off because people were just going through other things. They were having churchy services, but it's interesting that it's still that tactile thing, and the tragedies that are there as well. Like there's some of the kids in the family of that first generation who had that, and they had a couple of kids that died in their first year, and then you have some that lived longer lives. But it's interesting to hold that and at least say like that memory is there, even like a child that only lived it was either 2 or 3 days, but I have their name, I have the date that they were born, the date that they died. I've got that in their parents' handwriting in a pen that they held and took that ink to
In
that
that
page.
moment. Yeah.
And yeah, and it's in that moment, and obviously they added the dash and the death date when it happened, but the birth's there, and it's because sometimes you can see it's a different pen slightly, so it's like those moments are locked in that page forever, and that takes me straight back to that year.
Absolutely, it humanizes them, right? This is what a lot of people do with the dead in the West, particularly the Protestant West, is that because of that whole Christian mentality, we are not allowed to see the dead as being, right? They're either off in some purgatory or afterlife somewhere, right? Inaccessible, or they're now just gone because of Western rationalism, right? And so when we have these things in front of us, they're like, it's a reminder, oh yeah, they were real, right? Yeah.
Yeah, I remember being at a spiritualist church once. I was quite young, and I was sat in an open circle, and it's where anybody can act as the medium, anybody can be given a message. And I had this lady give me a message, and it was the only time I ever felt that someone was genuinely connecting to one of my ancestors, because of the description and the fact that she told me that something existed that I did not know about. But when I went home, I was given the same story and the object, and it now sits in this box up here that we were talking about earlier. That was my great granddad's spirit. And she said to me, there were certain notable, which would have seemed suspicious had it not been for the additional information that came with it, but notable spiritual workers and occultists from history that she said were trying to reach out to me, which I would have thought on its own was a bit of a suspicious thing. But about a week prior, the things they're quite known for were things that were suddenly on my mind, and then they just cut off. And she said they stood over there, and she pointed where the door was, which was quite a way away from me. And then she described this figure that I know is the description of my great granddad. And she said, he's told them to stand over there, and they can't come any closer to you, and he won't let them closer. And then I felt, and she didn't know that I could feel, but I always get this tap on my shoulder, but it's not a tap. It's a very kind of specific thing that, unless you experience it or know exactly what it is that he does, you couldn't describe it. It's not just like he's put his hands on your shoulder, he's tapped. It's a very specific thing. And I felt it. Then she told me it had happened. And then she said, oh, he's told me you already know that. You're familiar with it. And it was all that, and then me going home and talking to my nan. And then my nan went, oh, I've got that thing. It's in this box. And she got it out the box. And the story that went with it was matching to the story that I got from this lady at the church. And the strange thing about all of that was, as well, she wasn't even supposed to be there.
Interesting.
Yeah, she was meant to be going to a different spiritualist church. And then something happened, and she drove completely out of that town to my town.
I love it.
To be there. And yeah, and then my nan said, I think he wants you to have this. It was actually a medal that he got during the war for being a civilian firefighter during the war. So basically, bomb lands, he was going there to put the fire out and save people. And he got a particular honor medal that was given to people who did specific, very notable actions. So it wasn't just given to everybody who participated as a civilian. It was people who were noted as doing very specific things during the war effort, and he was one of those few recipients of that. So and I never knew that existed. I didn't even know that story. But
this is what they do. This is what they do, you know, like they create, like, the number of times that I've suddenly realized that I was born in spiritual beings, kind of experiences, right? You know, they do that. And that's when you know, oh shit, you know, and you get that, at least how I experience it, is that dawning realization of something just happened. And it's like, okay, something just happened, right? Do you experience that?
I do. I mean, I remember once I was driving home from college, I used to do, there was one college day that I did, and it was a really long day because when I was doing my therapy bit, we had an open clinic bit, so we had to have clients and be assessed on that. And the Tuesday night was, I say night because that's when I left, but it was 9 a.m. to 9 p.m. So that was how long we were there. It was 12 hours. And I was driving home this particular night. I was driving, and I normally speak to, again, that granddad to watch over me when I'm driving, particularly late. And I got this message, and it was very clear, and it was just, we don't intervene unless we're asked. And I thought, oh yeah, I hadn't asked him to watch over me, and I did. And then literally seconds later, a car come out flying out of a side street. I had to slam my brakes on doing an emergency brake. It was wet on the floor, the rain was bucketing it down, so I skidded. They skidded, and we went and just didn't collide. We just missed each other.
You didn't die.
No, I am very much alive. I can confirm.
I was worried there for a second. Yeah. Wow.
Yeah, the light isn't washing me out. This is
well, you never know. I mean, you're a magician, you know people, right?
I do. I know necromancers, so it's very possible.
Oh, that's something else, eh? Wow.
And
if you speak to people, a lot of people have those, like they do, but then the filters, right? The rationalism comes in. Oh, it was just nothing. Oh, it was just,
yeah,
right? Yeah,
definitely.
Oh, that's amazing.
I was wondering though, because you did talk about being a medium in your book, and I wonder, when was that first experience for you? When did you first say, this is something that I can do? I'm not necessarily saying when you realized it was something other people couldn't do, but when did you realize it was something that you could do?
I'm trying not to retroactively go back and retcon my story. I think I started playing with tarot cards when I was a teenager. But in truth, like, I've always experienced things. Like when I was in Wales, like I had hag attacks. I had a hag that would come to me at night and do things. Nothing sexual, don't worry. But like I always experienced, like there were little people who were like the little men who lived in the verge, or I always knew that there were like things peeking in at me from the window. So right, I had those experiences. But I think I didn't clue that in until mediumship until I was probably in university. And then a few years after that, I actually started working a psychic fair. Like I went in 2015, I started vending, and I started going to local psychic fairs. And then I had language I could actually use. And I know I talk about some of those experiences in the book, but I think it was a slow burn. It was almost like, when you start to realize that you're gay or bisexual or, anything other than straight, you just realize eventually, and then suddenly have wordage with it. But I do remember when I was a kid, talking to people that apparently weren't there. And I think that went away because of where I was at in my life, and it only came back. It really is like a muscle. I really do think it's like a muscle, and the more you do it. That's why at the psychic fair, I was just on, because in that environment, it's just in the air all the time, and it's just on. And so I had to work at it. A lot of my work right now is in weird. I'm working with those connections of the concept of weird. And I as a reminder to myself, I have it on my tattooed onto my body, and how I experience that dawning understanding of bigger things are happening in those interconnections. But the mediumship piece, I can turn it off when I need to, but most of the time it's on, and that comes in actually with my therapy work. Like I'll get the hunches, I'll get the information of, ask this question now, ask this question, like how, that intuition piece really comes in. Do you find that with your work, or do you turn it off and it's compartmentalized?
It depends. Through the consultation part, occasionally, but because my background is primarily hypnotherapy, I have to be very aware when I have somebody in clinical hypnosis, because I have to be monitoring them. My attention has to be on them, their responses, certain body clues as where their mind is, how they're doing, checking their breathing. So I have to have that attention switch. But definitely during the consultation phase, yeah. So it's a bit of both.
Yes. Yeah. It's an interesting thing. It's one, like, I think for me, I went through a period of my life where, again, where it was off, and I didn't believe it. I didn't look into it. I went through a period where I wasn't really practicing in my mid to late 20s. And it took a long time to get back. It did feel like going back into the gym again and actually, bringing out these abilities again. They were always there. They were just not, they were just not on. But once they were on, it became a lot easier to tap into it. Like we were saying before about the hunches, you were saying about the hunches with that piece, right? When you begin to realize that you're a pawn or you're a part of a process that's going on between spiritual beings, and that dawning realization that something's happened, and the shock of it, and it's like, oh, something just happened, right? When I was doing a dumb supper, I was the one that I was communicating with my grandfather through. I was working at a small bakery, and this was during the time I was training in psychotherapy too. So I went up to another city about an hour north of where I was living, and for this dumb supper. And I was working at the bakery then, and I was like, okay, well, what am I going to bring in? Because it's more of like potluck. So I picked up a small case of like 6 or 12 butter tarts, and I don't know if do you know butter tart?
I have an idea, but I'm not sure if I'm thinking of the right things.
Of course, yeah. So imagine if you have like imagine a what's it called, lemon curd tart, but the lemon curd is just caramel. That's what a butter tart is.
Right. Okay. So I was thinking something completely
different. So they're a big thing in North America. They're not as big over there, but like so I picked up these butter tarts and brought them up. And the woman who was running, she was one of the trainers. She was also a clinical supervisor of mine. And I brought them in, and she had just done a dumb supper earlier in the day. She was preparing for the next one, and they said, "Oh, I brought these to contribute." And she burst out into tears, and I said, "Oh God, what have I done?" She said, "No, you understand. You have to understand. I was really hoping that my dad would come through in the last dumb supper, and he didn't. And his biggest thing was butter tarts. And you've brought me butter tarts. That's my signal that he's going to come, right?" Now, when I was in the process of figuring out what am I going to bring to this thing at work, a few hours earlier, it was just whim that I would pick that up, right? But it's then that sudden realization of, oh shit, I was just a pawn in something else, right? And I think most people go through that, and we would never know because we don't get that feedback,
It's so true. It is so true. I've had people reach out to me at times where I've just put me, I don't post a lot on social media, and then I've posted things and then someone said, wow, that's completely just answered something that I just put out to the universe. I want some type of acknowledgement of something, and then I open Instagram or whatever, and your post was the first thing there, and it literally was the address that I needed to that point. And then it's like me just having this sudden impulse of posting something today what I was going to post 3 days ago. And it just tallies up. And I think, like you said, there are those little moments when you get that feedback and you realize that you're a piece, you're a cog in the machine.
Yeah, you're a cog in the machine. In truth, I learned more, and that's funny. I hope it wasn't a meme that you were posting, because that would just But in truth, I think my experience with Lucumí really taught me that, because the Orishas, the spirits of that, the whole pantheon of spirits of that tradition are on. I'll give you a very good example of that. So there was somebody in another country who I connected with, as I do. I connect with people, and they were getting to know me, asking me questions, all this and that, and then they happened to ask me, by the way, I know so and so is connected with another Ile in over there, and I've heard some weird things from them. And it turned out that the individual that they knew were talking, they were saying inappropriate things about their experience as a way of boasting. and they were just really inappropriate. They were casting their family, their spiritual family, in a wrong light. Now, what this person I was talking to didn't realize is that my godfather knew the godfather of this other person. So I went to my godfather and I said, you know, this was said about this other Ile, and it made me feel a little uncomfortable, all this and that. And he said, well, you know, I would encourage you to tell this other priest that his godchild is saying these things. So I did. And all of this was in the span of 24 hours. Now, these were things that really need to be said to this other priest, because it was not appropriate stuff, right? And so then this guy got back to me and said, why is my friend saying that his godfather is reaching out to him, blah, 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 blah. And I'm like, because I told my godfather about it, because it needs to be said, because it's inappropriate. He was like, oh my God. And then it was explained to me by the two priests. They said, no, these were the Orisha stepping in to be like, no, this is inappropriate. What this person is saying in this other country needs to be. And I'm like, oh, you know, a pawn in this whole machination, because this other guy didn't even know I was connected with Lucumí when we connected, right? There was no understanding of that. He only reached out because he wasn't sure. This meant that he wasn't at fault, his friend was, right? But it was such a powerful moment of, oh shit, everything's connected, right? You know.
Yeah, that's so true. It is mind-boggling what we realize when we sort of are willing to see it too. Some people aren't willing to see that they're a pawn being moved. They like you said, negative ego steps in. You said that earlier on, and people are always willing to accept that. Just as we can manipulate things, we're prone to it too.
Yeah, it's very true. And oftentimes we don't get to have that answer. We don't get to have that other side of the story. Sometimes we do. Another big example around that same time, this is really what jumped me off on understanding the interconnections here, was a woman came into work. She happened to look like a famous Olympian from Canada here, who I knew had spent time training in town. So I happened to say, oh, you Clara Hughes? She said, no, why did you ask? And so I said, oh, well, there's a local landmark on a big hill that she would often go and train in, going up and down, called Clara's Climb. And she was like, oh, that's cool. So I explained what the place was, and she was okay. 20 minutes later, she comes back in and she said, I just wanted to tell you that you solved a big problem for me today. I came to town because I was looking for photo shoot places, because I'm a scenic photographer. And I was looking for a place that I could go to and take scenic photography, because I didn't know the town very well. And Clara's Climb is exactly what I was looking for. So thank you very much. I'm like, fuck sakes, you know, what is going on, right? But if I hadn't, like, in that moment felt something to say, you know, then that would have, you know, so whoever was trying to, you know, create that situation for her could use me in that moment, right?
Yeah, sure. Yeah, definitely. So my last question for you is, it is possibly not going to be an easy question, but it might be. I don't know. So from your ancestral veneration work, and I'm not talking about, I will put a caveat on this straight away, I'm not talking about personal items and things like that, but if you could only retain one part of your ancestral veneration practice, so you had to strip it right back to one key thing, but I mean more in an abstract sense than, like, I'm not saying throw family heirlooms away or anything like that, what would you retain?
Family story. It will be the story, because the story is what gets passed down.
I love that. I really do. I was hoping it would be an easy answer, like it was, because it could be a complex thing. But yeah, story has been all.
Well, there's no money. There's no money to pass down, so.
That would have been such a great answer. I would keep the wealth.
I'll keep the money. Well, my last name isn't Rothschild. If it was, so, you know.
So, Ben, can you just show us your book one more time? So that is Ancestral Whispers by Ben Stimpson, which is available from literally everywhere that sells books.
Everywhere. Yes.
Everywhere.
Exactly.
So
Yes.
where can people find you, Ben?
benstimpson.com. That has all of my stuff on there. My podcast is on there too. And if people are wanting to, I have one of the few, like, I think you've only done less than like 5 interviews, and I'm one of them. So go onto the website and find Greg's fabulous interview that we did last year sometime. But yes, benstimpson.com.
That's very kind of you, thank you. Will you after send me, because you mentioned one of the exercise from your book being on the Llewellyn website, if you send me that, I'll drop that in the description. I'll drop your website in the description, and then people can find you better. So thank you, Ben, for being here and for being my first guest. Thank you to everybody who is watching for joining me on the first ever Witch the Pot, and I hope to see you all next time. If you have anything that you want me to pass on to Ben, how rude. Contact him yourself, go follow him. You're going to have his details, and they're going to be dropped in the description. Yeah, they will be in the description. Please, not the comments. I have had on other videos where people have not known where I put things. They won't be in the comments, they'll be in the video description. So check that out and follow Ben. And until next time, bye.
See you.